Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to lecture 13 of the NPTEL MOOCs course on economic growth and development. Today's lecture has been planned as a general lecture. It's a general class in which I have chosen to discuss one of the chapters of the very influential book named Hunger and Public Action by Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen. I have rather unimaginatively titled this lecture as Economic Growth and Public Support, directly taking from their book on hunger and public action. And I will presently explain why I have retained the title as such. But before we do that, let me give you a brief introduction to the book that we are talking about. Although this today's lecture is not entirely on the book, I have taken a page out of their book in the form of one chapter, and I'll tell you why it is important to look at the data given in this chapter and what relevance it has to our discussion on growth and development. So the book under question, review, it is essentially in the form of a review, but I would also discuss this paper. The book that I'm talking about here is titled Hunger and Public Action. This came out in 1989, written by Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen, based upon very careful research carried out by them at the World Institute of Development Economic Research in Helsinki. And the year in which this book came out is very important because this was the year in which a lot of transition was taking place with respect to the study on poverty, inequality, growth and development. And this book, so to say, came at such a juncture in which a lot of transition was taking place with respect to the discourse on what we understand or what we have understood so far as economic growth and development. So this book has 4 parts. It is written in 4 parts. The first part of this book, and the bullet points here that I have mentioned under each of these parts are basically the chapters of this book. And the first part makes extensive use of the concepts of entitlements and capabilities, and it explores the interactions between nutritional, economic, social and political elements that influence hunger and deprivation. So this book, to begin with, is primarily about hunger and deprivation, how hunger and deprivation came to be and what they mean by hunger and deprivation in the poorer countries of the world. Is it only economic in nature, or there are other social and political factors that go behind explaining hunger in the less developed countries of the world? The second part of this book focuses on problem of famine prevention, and there's a lot of attention given to Africa and India in the second part of this book here, where he's focusing on famines and social responses, famines, markets and interventions, strategies of entitlement protection, and experiences and lessons drawn from various countries in Africa and India. Part 3 of this book is devoted to the issue of fighting chronic undernutrition and lessons to be learned from the policies of China, India and also Sri Lanka, where there's a lot of data with respect to the experiences of direct support or public provisioning made in the social sector of Sri Lanka. The last part on hunger and public action, the economy, the state and the public, it draws together the main themes and concerns of the previous chapters, and it provides an integrated view of the role of public action in eliminating hunger. So this study basically suggested that there is some space for public action in solving the problem of hunger and deprivation of the third world. And in the case of famine prevention, Social Security could provide early warning systems and employment provision plans. And to fight endemic deprivation, the authors suggested that among other things, the basic healthcare, elementary education and food programs should be inherently looked at. Now, I have taken a leaf out of part 3 of this book, and particularly chapter 10, which is titled Economic Growth and Public Support. And as I have already said, rather unimaginatively, I have titled this general lecture also as Economic Growth and Public Support. And I am, so basically I have taken a page out of this book and I am presenting it to you as a general lecture, because I think that this has a lot of relevance to what we have been discussing so far about growth and development. Post today's class, we will study about the genesis of human development and how the literature of human development, how it has come up in the recent years, and how no evaluation of poverty, inequality and development is complete without engaging ourselves with the issues of and related to human development. So to be able to do that, therefore, this lecture will provide some sort of a bridge in providing to us context as to what country experiences reveal with respect to the strategies adopted for development of the standards of living of their people. So, before we move on further, let me also tell you that this chapter, Economic Growth and Public Support of this book, Hunger and Public Action, largely draws from the estimates of income and nutrition outcome indicators such as infant mortality rate and under 5 mortality rates of various countries based upon the estimates provided by the World Development Report of 1987, which is the latest considering that this book came out in 1989. So, the figures that come up may sound dated today, but the arguments that follow these figures, these estimates are still relevant, and the empirical evidences supporting these arguments have been increasing over the years. So, let me also inform you that I am discussing this chapter in the form of a general lecture very uncritically. Which means to say that there have been a number of critical reviews of this book, Hunger and Public Action. There have been a number of critical reviews of this chapter, Economic Growth and Public Support, raising questions about the arguments that have followed. And for those interested in looking at critical reviews of this book, may, among other scholars, make a beginning with Martin Ravellian, who has talked a lot about the methodology followed in this book for coming up with the conclusions that they have come up with. However, it is also, I must also mention here that Martin Ravellian also applauds this book for making a very significant contribution to the growth and development literature. So, now let me also give you a quick snapshot of if we have to summarize this book, this chapter on economic growth and public support, what would it sound like? So, this chapter basically talks about two strategies of development. One is the economic growth-led security strategy, and the other is the public support-led security strategy. And both of these strategies of development have been compared and contrasted, and the interconnections have also been seen between both of these strategies. They have also been seen against the concept of what Sen and Drez referred to as unaimed opulence, or what we can also term as unwarranted growth in the present times. So, let us look at this figure here that is appearing on your slide. By now, we know that the association between GNP per capita and the human development indicators such as health, nutrition, morbidity and mortality is not straightforward. Now, this table here shows the GNP per capita, the infant mortality rate and life expectancy at birth for selected countries. And the figures here will sufficiently illustrate the point that we have just made about there being no straightforward relationship between incomes and nutrition indicators. For example, if you see here, South Africa has nearly 6 times the GNP per head of China and Sri Lanka. Similarly, Brazil has many times more income than China and Sri Lanka, but has a lower life expectancy. So, and the striking among them all is Oman, whose GNP is 20 times that of China and Sri Lanka, but has the lowest life expectancy among them all. So just to repeat here, South Africa, Brazil, very high incomes per head, Oman, very high incomes per head compared to China and Sri Lanka, but lower life expectancy at birth compared to China and Sri Lanka. Similarly, if you look at the infant mortality rates per 1,000 live births for Brazil, South Africa and Oman, they are far higher than what we see in China and Sri Lanka. So it's a contrast. There are very high, the low levels of income, but high rates of achievement with respect to nutrition outcome indicators, IMR and life expectancy at birth, higher incomes, but lower achievements in terms of IMR and life expectancy at birth. So this is what Dress and Sen referred to, what is called the dissonance between GNP per head and the capability to survive premature death. So Brazil, Oman and South Africa, despite their richness of incomes, despite their opulence, or have much greater IMRs or infant mortality rates compared to China and Sri Lanka. And they identify two causes here. The first cause that they identify is that while high GNP per capita may show that there is a lot of richness of incomes, these richness of incomes need not necessarily translate themselves into distribution of incomes over their population or even distribution of income over their population. So while their levels of national incomes may be very high, the way the distribution of national income takes place within the economy, within the country, might be highly inegalitarian in nature, may be highly unequal in nature. So there is a lot of unevenness with respect to distribution of national resources or national income. So that's one of the reasons why this might happen, why the nutrition outcome indicators might come out to be very low, which means that people who do not have access to more incomes within these countries, let's say Brazil, for example, is a very striking case here. This has been highly cited in various literature coming up in this area, that Brazil is a highly unequal country where the poorest population have very less access to national incomes within Brazil. The second reason that Dress and Sen identify through this illustration that they are showing here is that while people have command over private commodities by interacting in the market, with regard to public goods which have very large externalities, public provisioning may be very important. The public goods, the nature of the public goods are such that they cannot be freely traded in the market like the private goods, or even if they may be, there may be a lot of underconsumption of these goods or overconsumption of these goods as well. Therefore, the nature of public goods is such that it may warrant public provisioning. So, for example, education or health or sanitation facilities and so on. So these are the two important causes they identify with respect to how to explain this illustration here. Now, to summarize this, while the relationship between GNP per head and nutrition outcomes may not be straightforward, that is also not reason enough to underestimate the importance of GNP per head. National incomes may go a long way in providing the required resources to the government to be able to translate the deprivation into a provision of basic capabilities. So, for example, the experience of different oil-rich countries have shown us that they have very actively followed public provisioning of goods based upon the resources generated out of the oil industry in those countries. So a high level of GNP per head may provide an opportunity for improving nutrition and other basic capabilities. So what is crucial here is to understand that this opportunity that is provided to the governments in the form of increased opulence or increased national incomes may or may not be utilized for direct provisioning or for distribution of these resources, these incomes among their population. So it is very important that the state, the government formulate redistributive policies that can go a long way in translating the opulence or translating the richness of incomes into the achievement of basic capabilities. Now, Dress and Sen also dispel a certain myth about Western countries, that there is a myth which says that the Western countries or the highly industrialized countries have in the past achieved very high levels of human development or very high levels of nutrition, such as the nutrition indicators such as life expectancy at birth, only based upon their incomes. So the standards of living have risen because of their unprecedented opulence, because of the rise in incomes. So Dresensen dispel this myth that Western countries have improved their life expectancy based purely on richness of incomes, and they argue against this by illustrating the history of longevity expansion in Britain and Wales in the 20th century. And this table here on your slide shows the increase in life expectancy at birth in England and Wales in each of the first 6 decades of the 20th century. This covers the period between 1901 to 1960, and it is important here that we are informed that the life expectancy figure in England in the beginning of the 20th century was no better than what we saw in the developing countries or what the developing countries experienced in the 1980s. And the increase in life expectancy, as you would see, was between 1 to 4 decades in each, 1 to 4 years in each decade, except the 2 decades of 1911-21 and 1940-51, which were basically the 2 decades of 2 world wars. And these 2 decades here saw dramatic rise in life expectancy, both for male and female, above 6 years in each of these decades here. And the decade of the and this was primarily because of public support, including public employment, food rationing and health care provisions. The decade of the 1940s, it has been recorded as the highest increase in British life expectancy. This period actually witnessed rapid transformation or rapid expansion of public employment, extensive and equitable food rationing, and it also saw the birth of the National Health Services in Britain. So the largest life expectancy increases was actually registered for the post Second World War period, and that was possible primarily because of direct provisioning or support of the government towards providing basic social services to its people. So through this illustration, Dresensen clearly show how important social intervention and public support can play, the important role that social intervention and public intervention can play in expansion of a very basic capability in the history of the first industrial nation. Now, given the distinct though interconnected roles played by overall opulence and public activism in enhancing capabilities, it is now possible to draw in principle a comparison between what is the growth mediated security strategy of development vis-a-vis what is the support led security strategy of development. And this is how Dresensen define or explain both of these strategies in this chapter on growth and public support. They define strategy of growth mediated security as something which promotes economic growth and takes the best possible advantage of the potentialities released by greater general affluence, including not only an expansion of private incomes but also an improved basis for public support. So this they call the strategy of growth mediated security. And the other alternative that they are referring to, the strategy of support led security, that basically means that the government you're resorting directly to wide ranging public support in domains such as employment provision. Here, this is one of the key factors: income redistribution, healthcare, education, social assistance, in order to remove destitution without waiting for a transformation in the level of general affluence. And this is the key difference between these two strategies here, the growth mediated security strategy and the strategy of support led security, without waiting for a transformation in the level of general affluence. And here success may have to be based on a discriminating use of natural resources, national resources, the efficiency of public services, and a redistributive bias in the delivery. So strategy of growth mediated security relies on its overall opulence, or the increase in opulence or the increase in richness of incomes, to be able to create critical resources that can be spent on the welfare of its people, that can be spent on creating basic capabilities for its people, whereas support-led security tries to bring about wide-ranging changes through public support in the domains of employment, healthcare, education, social assistance, without waiting for a transformation in the level of general affluence. And that's the key difference here. And that also means to say that the strategy of support-led security may resort to a discriminating use of national resources, which means that it will be based upon a lot of planning with regard to where the national resources need to be spent on, whether education needs more focus in a particular plan year, or health needs a lot of focus in a particular plan year, whether higher education needs a lot of focus in a particular plan year, and so on and so forth. Now, there have, of course, been detractors to both of these strategies of development. The detractors of the first strategy, the strategy of growth-mediated security, have been arguing that any growth-mediated security strategy of development basically leads to a lot of inequality within a country, which we have briefly seen in the last class, where I took a very short reference to the Kuznets curve, where the experience of the industrialized countries have shown us that at the initial levels of economic growth, economic inequality increases, and that gives rise to a lot of deprivation within the economy. So the detractors of growth-mediated security strategy of development have complained about glaring levels of inequality within a country, and therefore this need not be the most preferred strategy of development. Whereas the detractors of the strategy of support-led security have focused on the generosity provided to the poorer individuals within a country, and therefore which leads to a lot of wastage of national resources, and that adversely affects future growth prospects within the economy. So while there are detractors on both sides, both strategies of development, Dress and Sen very carefully point out that there are interconnections as well as contrasts between both of these strategies of development, and one needs to look at both of these. One need not necessarily mean the exclusion of the other. The basic objective of both of these strategies of development may be to create basic needs, to meet basic needs or create basic capabilities for its people, and therefore there is a scope for public provisioning of goods and services. So, to be able to drive home this point regarding whether to follow the strategy of growth-mediated security or support-led security, they illustrate this through some inter-country comparisons of performances. Here in this table that is showing on your slide, you will see that the estimates show under 5 mortality rate, which is basically taking infant mortality rate and child mortality rate together. So all those children who are below the age of 5, and the first column here shows the percentage reduction in under 5 mortality rate. The second and the third columns show the percentage growth rate of GNP per capita between two sub-periods, 1960 to 1982 and 1965 to 1985. The fourth column shows the GNP per capita in US dollars for 1985, and the last column shows the level of under 5 mortality rate for 1985. Now these estimates are taken from UNICEF and World Development Report of 1984 and 87. UNICEF had for the first time come up with, they had constructed the under 5 mortality rates for the period between 1960 to 85 for many countries across the world. And what Dress and Sen have done here is to put together the estimates for the developing countries, and from within the set of developing countries, they have illustrated here the example of 10 best developing countries based upon their percentage reduction in under 5 mortality rate vis-a-vis their percentage growth rate of GNP per capita for the period 1960 to 1985. So, and they have ranked the 10 best performance among the category of developing countries. This is in order of decreasing importance, which means that Hong Kong is the best performer country in terms of percentage reduction in under 5 mortality rate, and South Korea is the worst performer. But remember that these are the 10 best countries among the group of developing countries. Now they have then, after calculating the percentage reduction in U5MR vis-a-vis the percentage growth rate of GNP per capita for these 10 countries, they have divided these into two different categories or groups. One category is the countries that have followed the strategy of growth-mediated security, and the second is those that have followed the strategy of support-led security. The green highlighted countries here that I have highlighted on your slide are the countries that have followed the growth-mediated security strategy, and the others are the support-led security strategy. And the growth-mediated security has been an important part of the experience of Hong Kong, as we all know, Singapore and South Korea. So, Hong Kong, Singapore and South Korea have explicitly followed growth-mediated security strategies. And also a note here that these three countries were among the 5 fastest growing economies in the world during this period under consideration, which is 1960 to 1985, and that is in terms of the growth rate of real GNP per capita. You would see that I have marked UAE and Kuwait under a light green highlight here. Now, these two countries, these are the oil-rich countries, UAE and Kuwait. They can also be broadly put in this category, although their growth rates were significantly lower than Hong Kong, Singapore and South Korea during this period 1960 to 1985. And therefore, they are not comparable in terms of their growth rates. However, they can be put, they did follow growth mediated strategies and have been seen as being able to reduce their under 5 mortality rates and improving their general levels of nutrition within the country. Now, you may ask why their growth rates were not comparable with the other countries who have been identified as belonging to the category of growth-mediated security strategy. This was primarily because while UAE and Kuwait did see a phenomenal rise in their incomes, the method of calculation of GNP per capita during this period did not account for, was mostly a quantity index, the amount of goods and services produced within the economy, whereas the incomes or opulence that came to the countries like UAE and Kuwait were mostly because of the differences in the international price of oil. And because of the changes in the fluctuations in the international oil prices, there were large rise in incomes that accrued to these countries, which were then very diligently used by the governments of these countries, particularly Kuwait, in providing basic services. So, among the 10 countries, if we look at these 5 countries here, if we categorize them as following growth mediated security strategy, we can say that about half of these of the 10 highest performers have resorted to a strategy of growth mediated security. Now, the other 5 countries, Chile, Costa Rica, Cuba, China and Jamaica, they have had comparatively very low growth rates. So, their success cannot be attributed to income growth, but the possibility of support-led security. And the demographic and health records of each of these 5 countries have been extensively scrutinized in the literature of development, and there seems to be a very strong evidence of rapid nutritional improvements in all of these 5 countries, apart from the observed trends of reduced under 5 mortality and child mortality rates that we see. So, all of these 5 countries have always been at the center of debate and discussion with regard to social provisioning or the active role played by the state in provisioning of goods and or provision of social services. Now, moving on with this paper, Dress and Sen then bring out certain interconnections and contrasts between these 2 strategies. So, essentially what they are trying to say is that these 2 strategies of development need not be pitched against each other, but they need to be seen together, because the objective of both of these strategies are dealing with deprivations or providing basic capabilities to its people. So, there is no strict dichotomy between these 2 strategies of development, and these interconnections and contrasts need to be carefully seen, and therefore, this is a complex phenomenon. It needs to be carefully understood and studied. The first distinction they point out is that it is not a question of activism versus disengagement on the part of the state. They are saying that it has been seen that governments that have pursued growth mediated strategies have also pursued active distributive policies, for example, in the field of widespread promotion of skills and education, maintenance of full employment and so on. So all of these have been done while actively promoting growth oriented strategies. So it is not a question of whether a state is more active or whether the state is disengaging itself from provisioning of goods and services, because many growth oriented countries have at their core the objective of redistribution of incomes among their entire population, ensuring that the benefits of incomes reach through social provisioning or provisioning of social services to its entire population. The second point that they are pointing, which is an interconnection, basically the first 3 points show the interconnections between these two strategies, and the last point points out the contrast between these two strategies of development. So the second point he is making is that it is not a simple case of pitching the market versus state provisioning. Kuwait, for example, is a case in point where enhanced incomes did provide the material basis for one of the most comprehensive welfare states in the world. So it is not an either or case of market versus state provisioning. The third interconnection that he points out is that strategy of growth mediated security is not at all the same thing as the pursuit of economic growth. In fact, growth mediated strategy need not necessarily be in conflict with provision of basic needs, which may actually be an approach towards fulfillment of basic needs. And similarly, support-led security does not lead to surrendering of the importance or objective of economic growth. And empirical studies have actually shown us that improvements in quality of life, particularly in the domains of education and health, have gone on to improve labor productivity. So which means that state-led or support-led security can also go a long way in ensuring economic growth to its population. There are numerous studies, empirical studies that have been carried out to show the levels of or the improvements in human capital and how improvements in human capital lead to increases in labor productivity within a country. There are empirical studies which goes to the extent of coming up with actual estimates with regard to how much percentage increase in primary education or how many percentage increase in secondary education, higher education will go to how many percentage increase in labor productivity of a country. So there are evidences that show that interventions or investments made in human capital formation can also go a long way in ensuring economic growth within a country. The fourth point he points to is a contrast between these two strategies of development, and this contrast is that countries which have been identified as having used support-led strategy have not waited to grow rich before providing public support to guarantee basic capabilities. And now this contrasting point, the fourth point, is at the heart of the debate with regard to whether to follow growth-mediated strategy of development or support-led strategy of development, because the detractors of support-led strategy of development would say that economic growth should first take place, and economic growth by itself will take care of improvement in quality of life. What we very famously know as is the trickle-down effect of income, that as incomes grow, the very high incomes will trickle down to the lower sections of the vulnerable sections of the population within a country, and eventually they will also see a rise in their levels of income. However, as experience has shown us that the trickle down did not really take place. Rather, what has happened over a period of time is inequality has risen, inequality has grown at an unprecedented rate, and particularly in the post-globalized era. But those countries which have followed support-led strategies of development have very clearly illustrated that they need not wait for economic growth to take place for direct provisioning or public provisioning of goods and services to take place, and that is the major contrast between these two strategies of development. So essentially what Dreesen Sen are arguing here is that despite these complementarities, dilemmas can arise. There can be dilemmas with regard to striking a balance between these two strategies of development. And why is it so? The question regarding the dilemma is that because both of these strategies make a heavy demand on public resources. Both of these strategies make a very heavy demand on public administration capabilities. So which means which strategy to follow for development will depend upon how much demand the state or the people are making on the national resources of a country, and that is where the dilemma is. Now, Drezen Sen have also very carefully tried to locate the difference between growth mediated security and what they refer to as unaimed opulence. In the terminology of growth that we have been studying so far, we can also refer it to as unwarranted growth. So, another way of putting this question would be, is unaimed opulence or is unwarranted growth desirable, or is growth mediated security desirable? And that is what brings us to the difference between growth mediated security and unaimed opulence. Now, in many cases, an important part of the difference between growth mediated security and unaimed opulence relates to the expansion of employment opportunities. So, one of the things that the strategies that the countries following growth mediated security they do is that they very actively follow the economic policy of full employment. And if you recall from the previous classes regarding the definition of full employment, that basically means that there is no scope for involuntary unemployment. Or in other words, those who are seeking employment, those who want to be employed within an economy find employment. So, which means that there is no massive open unemployment within an economy, there is no involuntary unemployment within the economy. So, one of the basic differences between unwarranted growth rates and or countries following unwarranted growth or those following growth mediated security strategy is that the growth mediated security countries, they very deliberately try to follow the policy of full employment. And each of the 5 countries that Drezen Sen have identified as following growth mediated security, like South Korea, say for example, they have experienced extraordinarily low rates of unemployment during this period between 1960 to 1985. And this level of the low level of unemployment is low by the standards of the unemployment found in the developing countries of the world. And they have even relied on imports of labor power. So, therefore, the role of the state in promoting full employment has been quite obvious. So, there has been a rapid expansion of employment opportunities in these countries. They take the contrasting example of Brazil and South Korea to explain this point. Brazil has had very high growth rates, but Brazil also is a highly unequal country. So, the lowest quintile of the population has access to only about 2% of its national income, and this is backed by empirical data which is provided by them in their book. Whereas in South Korea, there has been extensive employment promotion through labor intensive industries, encouraging labor intensive industries. They have also maintained a comparative advantage of labor intensive manufacturing. They have done a lot of investments in education, skills development, training, along with supplementary public programs. Similarly, the welfare state model of Kuwait went to the extent of guaranteeing a job in the public sector to every Kuwaiti who is not employed in the private sector. So, essentially the instrumental role of expansion of employment opportunities to share the benefits of affluence is a crucial difference when one is trying to look at the differences between growth mediated security strategy and unaimed opulence or unwarranted economic growth rates. If a country is focusing only on bringing up the rates of economic growth, what is the difference between the countries who are very deliberately following economic growth led security strategy, and that is securing employment for their large masses of population. So, now we have got some clarity that growth mediated security does not necessarily make private incomes the engine of economic growth. Public provisioning also plays an important role to be able to achieve this. Now, this table here on this slide shows the performance of Kuwait during the years 1960 to 1985 in some of the social indicators. So, the indicators here show population, government oil revenue for the periods for the years 1960, 1965, 1970, 75, 80 and 85. So these are 6 years in point. There is data on public health expenditure, public education expenditure, number of teachers in government school, number of students in government schools, number of physicians in government schools, and the rate of illiteracy. And if you would see, while the population, the absolute number of population of course has risen over the period, government oil revenue has risen by about, if you look at the figures for 1980 and 1985, it is more than 3 times in 1980, and it is almost double of what you see, it is twice the growth of population in 1985. Health expenditures have been rising, public education expenditures have been rising. Number of teachers in government school has seen a dramatic rise from about 2000 in 1960 to more than 26,000 in 1985. Number of students in government schools, which is an important achievement, number of students in government schools have risen to about 361,000. Number of physicians have gone up from 451 in 1965 to more than 2,000 in 1985, and the rate of illiteracy have come down. Now, before we decipher this table, a little insight into Kuwait's oil industry has been provided by Drezen Sen, and I think it is important that we talk about that here. The Kuwait's richness dates back to 1946, when the country started exporting oil, and since then earnings in the oil sector has grown unprecedentedly. But before 1976, oil industry was not completely government owned, and most of the incomes that arose from the oil industry was in the form of taxes and royalties. However, since 1975, the oil industry of Kuwait has been completely government owned, and over a period of time, the entire profits of the oil industry has been appropriated by the Kuwaiti government. And this profit that has been entirely appropriated by the Kuwaiti government has, of course, been central to the Kuwait idea of welfare state, and the role of the state in encouraging or bringing about public provisioning of goods in the social sector. So the availability of, if you look at this table again here, the availability of public services in Kuwait has expanded in a record time. There has been compulsory, if you look at the policies followed by the Kuwaiti government in 1965, it followed the policy of compulsory school attendance combined with free education, free books, free meals, free transport, even free clothes, and that lured the younger generation to schools in spite of the fact that there was conservative resistance to educating girls in this country. The estimates shown in this chapter of this book, Hunger and Public Action, tell us that in 1977, the government subsidies on education actually exceeded $600 per student. It also says that the male secondary school enrollment ratio was 86% in Kuwait in 1982-84, which was better only by South Korea and a handful of other industrialized market economies. The sophisticated medical services provided free of charge to the entire population, Kuwaiti as well as non-Kuwaiti. Far-reaching public provisions were also made in areas such as housing, water supply, electricity, transport and communications, and the subsidization of basic commodities. In addition, Kuwait also had a system of large-scale direct transfers and financial help to low-income families, which is by any standards one of the most generous in the world. And to quote Drezen Sen from their own chapter, they pointed out that if socialism were reduced simply to state ownership of the means of production and generous provision of social wages, Kuwait would appear to be one of the most obviously socialist countries in the world. So this table sums up the marvelous achievements of Kuwait, which very deliberately followed a growth-mediated strategy of development, but along with a very active role of the state in formulating policies, progressive progressive policies that brought about rapid transformations in the domain of education and health, and because of which they could catch up with the industrialized countries of the world. Another case that Drezen Sen have very elaborately discussed in their book and in this chapter, Economic Growth and Public Support, is of South Korea. This table here shows the achievements of South Korea between 1960 and 1985. And again, this shows the infant mortality rate, the height of children aged 6, which is basically an anthropometric measurement. So it's a nutrition achievement indicator. It also shows the incidence of poverty, the Gini index of income inequality, unemployment rates, index of real wage rates. Basically, it tells us the levels of wages, the industrial wage rates in the economy, and the secondary school enrollment. So, if you read this table from the top to bottom from 1960 to 1985, you see that the infant mortality rates have come down dramatically. Anthropometric measurement of children, the height of children within the age of 6 for both male and female seem to have increased. Now, increase in height is one of the very important nutrition indicators of good health of children. So, while IMR has been declining, the anthropometric measurement of height for age shows that there has been an increase. And remember that South Korea has been dubbed as an economic miracle, has been dubbed as one of the East Asian countries which has seen rapid rates of transformation in the economy in a very short span of time. Incidence of poverty has come down dramatically from 41 to 7% in 1985. Compare and contrast this to India, where the Indian poverty rates are still about 29% as of today. Gini index shows that levels of inequality have been low and it has been declining by small percentage points. Unemployment rates have come down and they have been maintained. Wage rates have been rising and secondary school enrollment rates have also been rising. Now, it is important to remember here, as pointed out by Drezen Sen, that before 1976, South Korea had no public healthcare system. They had no form of broad-based medical assistance or medical insurance schemes in healthcare. Healthcare was primarily provided by private professionals and in the form, and especially pharmacists. South Korean government had consistently rejected the welfare state model. And so, this will give reason enough to conclude that the South Korean miracle points to of improvements in quality of life is mostly a private enterprise doing. It came about because of the efficiency of the private enterprises or the efficient functioning of the markets. However, Drezen Sen bring out some serious qualifications to this conclusion. Serious qualifications that need to be kept in mind before coming to these conclusions regarding the South Korean miracle. First, they point out is that South Korea in the 1940s already had a base for equitable growth. And how? This was primarily through a relatively equal distribution of assets, particularly education and land. So, what they had done was a government had played a major role in equitable growth, in ensuring equal distribution of land and education, and this equitable growth was reinforced by the labor intensive orientation of their industry, and this orientation took place within a structure of incentives and inducements worked out by their government. So, if one is to claim that, so they claim that it is impossible to understand, Drezen Sen claimed that it is impossible to understand South Korea's experience without reference to the major role played by the government in enabling the population to participate fully in the process of growth. Second point that they refer to is that South Korea's economic expansion was also due to the conducive economic environment provided to the private enterprises by the state. So, which means during the period of 1970s and 80s, the 60s, 70s and 80s, there have been evidences of extensive credit control and incentives, import substitution measures, infrastructural investments and sophisticated tax administration system. And they also show that South Korean government had actually had regular 5-year plans, have had regular 5-year plans since 1962, and they have very efficiently tried to implement these 5-year plans as well. So, if one is to say that the South Korean growth experience, or what has been dubbed in the literature of growth and development as a South Korean miracle, has been without any government intervention, it is it is a misnomer, it is an overstatement. And so, the South Korean miracle with respect to income growth needs to be very cautiously approached, as illustrated by Drez and Sen. Now, this is about the growth, the countries which have seen growth mediated, which have adopted growth mediated strategies of development. It also makes sense to see how the countries that were identified as following support-led security strategy of development have performed in contrast to those countries which have had more or less similar levels of GNP per capita or income per capita. The countries that they had identified were China, Jamaica, Costa Rica, Chile and Cuba, and here this table here shows the figures for this table is in two parts. The first part here shows the figures for China, Jamaica, Sri Lanka, Guyana, Costa Rica, Burma, Chile, Mauritius, Hong Kong and Madagascar, but we will focus on these 5 countries here: China, Jamaica, Sri Lanka, Costa Rica and Chile. And it is important that we know that these countries that were identified here, they have deviated from the standard relationship between GNP and mortality. Basically, China, Jamaica, Costa Rica and Chile have been able to attain very low rates of, improved rates of under 5 mortality in spite of having low rates of growth rates of GNP. But it is important to point out Sri Lanka here, which is an exception among these countries, because Sri Lanka has had very low growth rates of GNP per head between the period 1965 to 1985, and however it had the comparable reduction in under 5 mortality rate is as good as it was in China, despite having low growth rates compared to China. And the Drez and Sen argue that Sri Lanka did not grow dramatically during this period 1960 to 1985, but something miraculous happened in Sri Lanka prior to that. So according to them, accelerated breakthrough in mortality reduction took place in Sri Lanka in the 1950s and the 1940s. There was rapid growth of public support in the form of free or subsidized ration, expansion of public health services and so on. And these breakthrough in expansion of health services and public services in Sri Lanka led to a rapid expansion of or improvement in living standards of people within the country. So this can be largely attributed to decades of rapid growth of public support in the form of free or subsidized distribution of rice, public health services and so on. So the Sri Lankan country has had a different time pattern from other countries, and Sri Lanka's pioneering experience has been of great general interest among the different countries of the world. And this has Sri Lankan experience has also been shown as one of the important case studies in studying growth and development in the period of the 1990s and the 2000s. Now, to conclude this lecture on economic growth and public support-led security strategies of development, these are the 3 main points that Drez and Sen are making. They are saying that whether immediate and extensive measure of public support in a poor country lead to slower economic growth is an extremely complex question, and it needs to be dealt with very cautiously. The interactions between public support and economic growth include not only dilemmas and trade-offs, but they also include many positive links. But if the focus is more on the dilemmas and not on the positive links, then there will not be much scope left for public support in bringing about or providing basic capabilities to people. So what is worth noting here is that given the very large growth equivalent of public support, only the trade-off between public support and economic growth would seriously undermine the case of extensive involvement in public support at an early stage of development. So while there are trade-offs and there are interconnections, it is important that we look at the interconnections between public support and economic growth, so that sufficient importance need to be given can be given to public support at an early stage of development, because the experience of some of the poorer countries of the world have shown that while their economic growth rates have not risen dramatically, because the state has played an important role in providing to the social sector, they have been able to achieve very high levels of human development. I'll see you in the next class. Thank you.